Hi, this is Chris Nair with the Ire Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is another 2 chapters of the Korean War, A History, book by Bruce Cummings. So let's get started. The Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download the book. The PDF will be in the description section. And I recommend you read this book, read it as an ebook, and read all my books. And I also recommend you buy the print book of this book from Amazon, and also buy all of my print books, as that helps keep them in print and helps us, retain the information better than if we just read it as an ebook. So yesterday we discussed Acheson and Truman's prestige. Okay, they did the Korean War as a prestige thing. They thought American credibility had been lost through their loss of China. And so they tried to use the Korean War as a way to regain that prestige. So what happened? They could have stopped after, defending South Korea from attack of an invasion of North Korea to the demilitarized zone. But instead, they proceeded to roll back communism and invaded the North, which was a flop invasion. It would cause massive destruction and a stalemate. Over 5 million people were killed as a result of that mistake. Okay, see, the United States always makes the wrong decision. In any situation where there is a binary decision, a strategic thought that you have to decide one way or another, they always decide the wrong way. I don't know what it is with Washington. They're always doing the wrong thing. They're always snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. But in the end, no matter what you say, the bottom line remains is that they're hateful, jealous, anti-third world, white racists. And that is what we say about the Washington bureaucrats in all of their administrations that have made mistakes all across the board. Okay, so basically, the victory of the United States would have occurred if they had stopped at the demilitarized zone. If they had stopped and not invaded North Korea, the United States would have won this conflict and won back their credibility. But Truman destroyed himself, and Acheson destroyed himself as a result of this attack on North Korea. Not only did he destroy it, but he left MacArthur, a crazy, deranged white general, to destroy North Korea with firebombing and napalm using air power. This is what we say. You team up with a murderer in the army, and then you become a murderer yourself. And they have no excuse for this mistake, this major mistake. Okay, mistakes aren't forgiven that easily. Washington thinks North Korea should forgive this mistake. China should forgive this mistake. Nobody forgives such mistakes in which 5 million people die as a result of your, reckless action, your hateful, jealous, anti-third world, white racist action against the North Korean, South Korean, and Chinese people. So remember the racist, hateful, jealous, anti-third world whites. Baldwin, we talked about Thomas Baldwin, the New York Times editor. He referred to Koreans as locusts, fanatics. Korean life is cheap. Barbarians, they don't follow the rules of war. Okay, this was a bigot. This was a bigoted white American. Bigots are, just a wide scale in the United States. And Thomas Baldwin was another bigot, a hateful anti-third world, jealous white. And that's what he said. In addition, Telford Taylor of Nuremberg also issued a statement that said that rules of war in the Orient are different from the Occident, in that the Asians' life is cheap. That is because your white racists of the West consider Asian life as cheap. Your hateful, jealous, racist whites consider Asian life as cheap. And that is why you say this. Asian life is just as important. Asians are just as, grieved by murder of their family. Asians are not immune to pain of murder and torture by the American white racist, jealous, hateful American government. So in addition, we talked about atomic bomb threats on the Korean peninsula and China. So America, they were losing this war. China had taken back territory, and Truman decided, we'll use the atomic bomb. Okay, again, on the Korean peninsula and China, life is cheap, right? You're going with Telford Taylor's, nonsensical statement. Okay, Truman, basically, he was deranged. He was a mentally deranged man that decided, let's, nuke them in China and, Korean peninsula. Who started it? That's another issue we discussed yesterday. It's a very shady American propaganda that says that North Korea started this conflict. But then you can't explain why South Korea's Rhee was dangerous and not elected democratically and was not liked by the public, the popularity of South Korea, nor was he liked by the North Koreans. He probably instigated the invasion of the North, is what Col James, a UN Australian, who said that the 17th Regiment attacked the North at Onjin and resulted in the North's full-scale invasion. Regardless, it's clouded in secrecy, and it's clouded in lack of complete, truth. There's not complete truth, but it could have gone either way, according to Bruce Cummings. The North invaded as a result of a South Korean provocation, a major provocation and escalation at the border during the 17th Regiment's attack by Col James had witnessed, the one that he had witnessed. 5 million are dead. U.S. was responsible for the burned civilization of Korea with napalm. That is why we said, always, America always makes the wrong decision. It is always the wrong choice, and the American government never repents for their wrong choices across the board. So, finally, Eisenhower threatened the Korean peninsula with nuclear attack, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended a nuclear attack on China. So they obviously carried this conflict way high, way in their delusional heads in Washington, that you're allowed to nuke somebody because they, are attacking you and winning a war. They are hateful, jealous racists of Washington. Quiz: U.S. attempt to roll back communism in Korea by invading the North destroyed American credibility in Korea and resulted in the Korea's forgotten war. That's true. U.S. attempt to roll back communism in Korea by invading the North destroyed American credibility in Korea and resulted in the Korean forgotten war. Racism was embodied by American GIs, referring to Koreans as gooks, prostitutes, the rape of Korean women, and indiscriminate killing of children with napalm. That's true. Racism was embodied by American GIs, referring to Koreans as gooks, prostitutes, rape of Korean women, indiscriminate killing of children with napalm. Thomas Baldwin referred to Koreans as locust insects, barbarians who needed to be civilized. That's true. We read that yesterday. Dean Acheson's decision with Truman to cross the 38th parallel resulted in the violent deaths of 4 million Koreans and Chinese. That's true. Dean Acheson's decision with Truman to cross the 38th parallel resulted in the violent deaths of 4 million Korean and Chinese. Truman threatened China with nuclear attack, annihilation, as well as the Korean peninsula, and readied atomic bombs to Guam, although did not use them because the Chinese were not interested in taking over South Korean territory. That's true. Truman threatened China and the Korean peninsula with nuclear attack and readied atomic bombs by Guam, though he did not use it because the Chinese were not interested in taking over South Korean territory. So let's get started. We finished the course of the war, so we're going to do the party of memory. On April 25th, 2007, the New York Times carried a photo of North Korean soldiers goose-stepping through Pyongyang on the severity of the 75th anniversary of the founding of their army. The Times noted that the regime itself was founded only in 1948, but carried no more information. Another article announced the arrival of the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in Washington to visit George Bush. Neither there nor in any article that I saw in the press after Abe came to power were these two events connected. Abe is the grandson of a Class A war criminal and post-war Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, who was the head of munitions in Manchuria in the 1930s. Another recent Prime Minister, Aso Taro, also had direct links to Japan's empire. He was heir to a rich mining fortune and a family company that used thousands of Korean forced laborers during the war, which had a particular reputation for brutality and terrible working conditions. Allied POWs, mainly Australian and British, were also forced to work there. As the grandson of Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, Aso's lineage traces back two leaders of the Meiji Restoration, and he is related by marriage to Kishi and Sato Isaku, another prime minister, to Abe Shinzo, and indeed to the emperor's family. If the DPRK features hereditary communism, post-war Japan is hereditary democracy. Often 70 to 80% of their parliamentaries have inherited seers from their fathers, of course, from politically prominent families. When a person like Abe or Asa comes to power in Japan, Pyongyang remembers what others don't know or forgot their genealogy. It would be difficult to exaggerate the ingrown solipsism of North Korea's leaders, but it is often matched in the right wing of the Liberal Democratic Party. In 2008, the chief of staff of the Air Staff Defense Force, Tamago Toshio, a man known to be close to Mr. Abe, published an essay that we might well have been entitled, quote, "Everything I wanted to know to declare about Japan's war since 1895, but was afraid to say." Like many members of the Japanese elite, General Tamajimi is an entirely unconstructed believer in the virtues of Japan's colonial mission and the justice of its wars against China and the United States. In 1937, Japan was lured into the Sino-Japanese War by a Comintern manipulated Chiang Kai-shek. He claimed a Kremlin conspiracy carried out by its spies in Washington, such as Harry Jexter White, initiated U.S. entry into the World War II, and thus Japan was drawn into it. Roosevelt was duped because he was not aware of the terrible nature of communism. In passing, Tamagami lauded Colonel Kim Suk-won, who led 1,000 Japanese troops and trampled the army from China, the former suzerain state that had been bullying Korea for hundreds of years. He was decorated by the emperor of his meritorious war services. General Tamagami not only poured salt into Korean wounds by lauding their Benedict Arnold, but had spoken so clearly that dismissal on October 31st, 2008 was the prime minister's only option. But his essay still won the top prize, $30,000 in a contest sponsored by a wealthy hotel and condominium owner. As for Mr. Abe, he selected March 1st, 2007 to announce that no evidence existed to show that any women forcibly recruited into the multitudinous ranks of the Pacific War, quote, comfort women, and from Japanese, sex slaves to everyone else. That is to say, forcible in the narrow sense of the word. He elaborated and then proceeded to try to clarify that opaque distinction for many succeeding days and weeks, and ultimately just, quote, apologized for himself on March 26, 2007, while never retracting his original formulation. "I apologize here and now," he said, without really indicating that what he was apologizing for, and then said, quote, "I express my sympathy toward the comfort women and apologize for the situation they found themselves in." Here, Mr. Abe pays fealty to his departed comrades in arms. Former sex slaves often said that soldiers would clean up, button up, and then offer awkward apologies to them on the way out of the door. Japanese historians had written about the sexual slavery system for decades, but were told time and again by the authorities that no archival documents existed on it. In 1992, the historian Yoshiaki Yoshibi walked into the military library and found many such documents just sitting on the shelf. His 1995 book, Comfort Women's Sexual Slavery in the Japanese Military in World War II, is now a standard source, but his findings were also direct impedance for Foreign Minister Kono Yohei's 1993 apology, stating that many were recruited against their will through coaxing and coercion. Abe essentially repudiated this statement. Dr. Yoshiaki and other historians determined that somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 women were in the system by the time it was fully established, the vast majority of them Korean. Of course, many were lured or tricked into service with promises of ordinary jobs before being compelled into slavery. It is difficult to think of a more sordid transgression by a modern army than this one, trampling the lives and decency of such a multitude of racially despised women. Korea's venerable tradition of male chastity is still reflected in common masses given to babies, in the chatter-like head-to-toe garments worn by elite women when they ventured out of their homes in the old days and the female inner sanctum of the home. The character for peace and tranquility depicts a woman under their roof. But in the past century, millions of foreign soldiers have had their way with Korean women. Sarah Soe showed the actual number of sex slaves was perhaps 50,000, still a terrible figure. But the first document comfort station was established in Manchukuo in 1932 to 1933. And as early as 1938, about 30,000 to 40,000 women, primarily Korean, quote, were already in the system of China. Her book also illustrates in detail that many procurers, more than half of candidates for Japanese military brothels, were in fact Koreans. Korean men also joined the Japanese military in great numbers, but as soldiers, a minority as volunteers, and a majority as draftees. About 187,000 Korean soldiers and an additional 22,000 sailors served during the war and also availed themselves of comfort stations. The South Korean army then set up a similar comfort system during the Korean War, sometimes using women kidnapped from the north. Many sex slaves were utterly ruined individuals, dared not return to their families, and thus had no alternative but to continue working in the fetid brothels along the United States military bases in Japan, Okinawa, Korea, and the Philippines. Mr. Abi's forcible in the narrow sense of the word turned out to mean that military officers did not kick down the doors of homes and drag teenage women off by the ear, but it was forcible in the broad sense of the word, quote. Abi later acknowledged in that civilian brokers, colonial stooges, lying pimps, and businessmen claiming to have a good factory jobs inveigled young women into this degradation most foul. Initiation usually meant rape, especially if the victim was a virgin. If for once Mr. B could put himself in the shoes of a young woman fooled into a, quote, job, taking on 40 or 50 soldiers a day, held as prisoners for months and years, given only bare subsistence living, he would drop to his knees and beg forgiveness. Scholarship on this subject, almost always done by women, illustrates the awful life chances, family catastrophes, and casual degradations that lead women into prostitution in East Asia or anywhere else. Of course, only a minority of Yanfu were prostitutes in the first place, and many were forced into it, quote, in the narrow sense of the word. A dominant clan in a Korean village would tell a Japanese official, and a Korean policeman were to find a pretty young girl among the residents of the subordinate clan households, and she was either inveigled with promises of education, of a job, or just thrown bodily into the back of a truck. Prime Minister Abi's fumbling and craven performance took place on a national holiday in Korea, marking the countrywide uprising against Japanese colonial rule that began on March 1st, 1919. March 1st is also the day in 1932 that Japan chose to inaugurate Manchukuo. Imagine that this debate were in Germany, Tessa Morris Suzuki wrote, and the leader in question was named Krupp. Americans shouldn't comfort themselves and feel unconnected to all of this, or point out how awful the Japanese are compared to Germans who have sincerely tried to come to terms with their history and so on. We are the ones who organized the unilateral occupation of Japan, provided with remarkably soft peace, refused war reparations to its near neighbors, and put people like Kishi back in power, as Herbert Bix illustrated in his prize-winning book, Hirohito and the Making of Japan. Americans also appear oblivious to wounds of empire that are still raw in Korea and haunt present-day relations with Japan. Origins and beginnings. Friedrich Nietzsche famously questioned the origin of human events. The search for origin pushes ever backward in time and is subject to endless revision. But he does not say that beginnings never occur. Beginnings for his genealogy of morals is the Bible and 2 millennia of misinterpretations of its teaching. The beginning of the Korean War was in 1931 to 32, after Japanese forces invaded the northeast provinces of China and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. They quickly faced a huge, if motley, army of guerrillas, secret society, and bandit resistance in which Koreans were by far the majority, constituting upward of 90% of the entities, such as the Chinese Communist Party, partly because the eventual top leaders and thus the main historical lineage of this party resided in Southeast China in the early 1930s. They quickly found a minority of Koreans who would collaborate with them in killing these resistors. By the mid-1930s, the man who took the nom de guerre, Kim Il-sung, was a well-known and formidable leader of guerrillas. At that time, the head of the Central Command Control Committee of Police Affairs for Manchukuo and a concurrent provost marshal of the Kwantung Army, the name of Japan's armed forces in Manchuria, was General Toho Hideki, in command when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and subsequently sentenced to death for his war crimes by the U.S. occupation under General Douglas MacArthur. Toho played a crucial role in unifying ordinary police with the feared military police, Kempeitai, although the Koreans tracking down and killing Korean and Chinese guerrillas was Tomagami's hero Kim Sok-won, who commanded the 30th Parallel in the summer of 1949 from the southern side, of course. The Manchurian Crucible produced the two most important leaders of post-war Korea, Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee, and several leaders of post-war Japan. For example, Kishu Nobusuke not only was responsible for munitions in Manchukuo, but later worked together with Shima Etsu Saburo and several others in the mid-1950s to form the mainstay of the Liberal Democratic Party, along the core of Japan's peculiar one-party democracy. To the North Koreans, it is less the Japanese than the Korean quislings that matter bloody enemies. They essentially saw the war in 1950 as a way to settle the hash of the top command of the South Korean army, nearly all of whom have served the Japanese. During the Korean War, this was barely known to Americans, and when known was deemed of a dubious import because then Japan was our ally. This is not a matter of what we think, however, what they think. The Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 is akin to the Nazi occupation of France in the way it dug deeply and has gnawed at the Korean national consciousness ever since. Manchuria is also Greater Korea. Two patriots who remember the wide sway that Koguryo Kingdom, 17 BC to AD 668, 37 BC to AD 668, had in the region, and the Koguryo begins Pyongyang's lineage of critical Korean antecedents for its own republic. Kim Il-sung began by fighting the Japanese in Manchuria in the spring of 1932, and his heirs trace back everything to this distant beginning. After every other characteristic attached to this regime, communist, nationalist, rogue state's evil enemy, it was, first of all and above all else, an anti-Japanese entity. A state narrative runs from the early days of the anti-Japanese insurgency down to the present, and is drummed into the brains of everyone in the country by an elderly elite that believes anyone younger than they cannot possibly know what is meant to fight Japan in the 1930s or the United States in the 1950s, allied with Japan and utilizing bases all over Japan, and more or less ever since. When you combine deeply ingrained Confucian patriarchy with filial piety, with people who have been sentient adults for more or less than since the Korean War beginning in 1950, you have some sense of why North Korea has changed so little to top levels in the recent decades, and why it is highly unlikely to change radically before this elite and its relentlessly nationalist ideology leaves the scene. The average age of the top 20 leaders in North Korea in 2009 was 75. Of the top 40 leaders in 2000, only one was under 60, Kim Jong-il. The gerontocracy draws a straight line from 1932 onward, brooking no deviation from this most important of all North Korean legitimations. Diane Sawyer may not be the best example, but when she took an ABC crew to North Korea in late 2006, she interviewed General Yi Chan-bok, who commands the DMZ on the northern side. "How long have you been there?" she asked sweetly. 40 years, quote, he replied to her amazement. He has been getting up every morning to rifle through the enemy's order of battle since the year before the Tet Offensive effectively ended the American effort in Vietnam. For decades, the South Korean intelligence agencies put out the line that Kim Il-sung was an imposter, a Soviet stooge who stole the name of a Korean patriot. The real reason for this smokescreen was the pathetic truth that so many of its own leaders served the Japanese. But think of the contradiction. There was someone named Kim Il-sung heroically fighting the Japanese, even if it was somebody else. And what were you doing, sir? This canard quickly took on a glow of truths. Thus, when the leading scholar of Korean communism, Dae Suk-soo, was finally allowed to explain the real story of large audience to young people in Seoul in 1989, upon hearing that Kim Il-sung was in fact a hero of the resistance, they all burst into applause. Meanwhile, the North Koreans took Kim's admirable record and piled on enough exaggeration and myth to insult the intelligence of a 10-year-old. But somewhere along the yawning chasm between the desperate lies of the former South Korean governments and the ceaseless hyperbole of the North Koreans, there is a truth. Two Koreas began to emerge in the early 1930s, one born of an unremittingly violent struggle in which neither side gave quarter. Troops experienced in Manchukuo burned the souls of the North Korean leadership. The other truth is the palpable beginning of an urban middle class as people marched not to the bugle of anti-Japanese resistance, but into the friendly confines of the Huaxin department store, movie theaters, and ubiquitous bars and tea rooms. The complexity of this moment in Korea, when 75% of the population were still peasants and a burgeoning working class bustled along a tiny middle class in the streets of Seoul, were brilliantly captured in Kwang Kyung-a's 1934 novel. From Wan So-pan, a writer and quintessential, quote, new woman Shin Young. At one point, Kang wanted to join the guerrillas in Manchuria, and she later worked with hundreds of other young women in a new textile factory in Incheon, part of Seoul. With an acute critical sensibility, Kang charted the arrival of urban modernity, the trails of modern boys and modern girls, while saving her fury for the fraught lives of Korean women and satire for the alienated suffering of the blasted intellectuals, all words and no action. Even when they spoke out and went to prison, she wrote, they converted under Japanese suasion and got off scot-free. No earlier generation of Korean women could possibly have had her experiences, her Brechtian experiences. The measures taken. Brecht began his 1931 play with, quote, this revolution marches forward even in that country. The ranks of fighters are well organized even there. We agree with the measures taken, he wrote, about communist agitators dispatched from Moscow to Manchuria to fight their oppressors. But the agitators also killed a comrade. We shot him and cast him into a lime pit. Why? He endangered the movement. The play thus begins. It ends with the lines above. Like Antigone, the fall comrade was cast into a pit. Like Sophocles, Brecht thrust the reader into a widening gyre of power and justice. Were the measures taken right or wrong? But he doesn't render a definitive judgment. Unlike Sophocles, instead, he left the dilemmas for the cast and the audience to sort out. Every evening, the measures taken was staged. Brecht could have not have known how fitting his play would have seemed a few months later, when Korean agitators took up arms against the new puppet state of Manchukuo. They found themselves ensnared by pitiless overlords, a complex mix of Korean immigrants and a local Chinese population filled with ethnic hatred, yielding a daily bread of life and death risk, dubious if not foolhardy odds, bad moral choices and worse moral choices. Brecht's play appears to be the opposite of Antigone. Instead of justifying individual resistance against the state, all measures must be taken to assure the revolution's victory, even if it means sacrificing the individual. That isn't quite what he means. He wanted an audience to grapple with the terrible dilemmas of revolutionary action versus the daily violence of the status quo in extremis. Hitler rising power, the demise of any liberal options, and the alternative of communist revolution. The political milieu of bleak choices between the extremes of right and left inhabited most of Europe and East Asia during the Great Depression, and it is in this milieu that the North Korean leadership came of age and established itself. Korean resistors faced militarists capable of anything and quickly concluded that violent struggle was their only viable option. Nearly 80 years later, that state still stands, likewise against all odds, still arrayed against Japanese militarism and against American power. But these distant origins is a barely known struggle in an obscure corner of the Pacific War. Even in that country, hold a key to why American leaders have consistently underestimated their opponents who hold power in Pyongyang. Over time, the Japanese built a textbook case of how to fight an insurgency by any means necessary, and the Koreans found the nucleus of a guerrilla state that would come to power amid the ashes of Japan's defeat at the hands of American power. Japanese counterinsurgency was premised on using climate, terrain, and unflinchingly brutal methods to separate guerrilla bodies from their peasant constituents, and harsh interrogation and thought control of poison to destroy their minds. Winter drastically shifted the advantage to suppression forces. It made guerrillas stationary and counterinsurgents mobile. A former Japanese army officer put it, the guerrillas holed up in the winter shelters, and well-fortified and protected troops sought out and burned. Rebuilding them was next to impossible because everything is frozen. Frigid weather denied guerrillas the protection of thick foliage and undetected movement. Military encirclement and blockade isolated these base areas and prevented resupply of food and weaponry. Large armies established the blockades between the mountains and the low-lying fields and villages. Small search and destroy units then entered the mountains to ferret out guerrillas, often by tracking their footprints in the snow. Japanese imperial forces were willing to go to any lengths to break the relationships between guerrillas and the sea of people in which they swam, slaughtering suspected peasant collaborators. Millions of Chinese died in kill all, burn all, loot all campaigns, as they were called, relocating large populations into concentrated and protected villages and either executing or converting, quote, captured guerrillas. Japanese counterinsurgency experts told Americans that because of the close relationship between guerrillas and peasants, semi-bandits must be abolished, quote. Who were semi-bandits? Peasants who supported guerrillas by refusing to give information on guerrillas or pay taxes. In other words, almost anybody in a peasant village. The Japanese established white cells, quote, of supportive collaborators to counter guerrilla, quote, red cells. Once guerrillas were captured, they were either routinely shot or put through intensive thought reform methods to turn them around. The Japanese term is tenko. They would then become leaders or members of the anti-communist groups or of so-called concordial associations promoting Japanese-Korean unity. When Japan's bacteriological warfare criminals in Unit 731 in Harbin needed more logs, maruta, in which to do live experiments, they would call the local prison and say, send us more communists. Careful scholarship in recent years made possible by the availability of new Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Soviet documents, and by the hard labors and open minds of a younger generation of historians, has now made clear that Koreans formed the vast majority of resistors to the Japanese takeover of Manchuria, native home for the rulers of the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911. By the early 1930s, 1 million Koreans lived in the prefecture of Kando. Jiando in Chinese alone. Long a Korean immigrant community just across the border in China, and since 1949 an autonomous Korean region in the People's Republic of China. Most Koreans had moved to Kando in hopes of escaping Japanese oppression, although some previous emigrants had also gotten wealthy developing the fertile soil of Manchuria, yielding tales that farming families could double or triple their income by relocating there. By and large, though, these Koreans were very poor and thoroughly recalcitrant in their hatred of the colonizers, and remained so in 1945 when U.S. intelligence estimate that 95% of the nearly 2 million Koreans in Manchuria were anti-Japanese, and only 5% were sympathizers and collaborators. Japanese officials saw the Korean colony as a model for Manchuria and encouraged Korean allies to think that if they helped colonize Manchukuo, Korea itself might get closer to independence. A certain degree of collaboration, of course, was unavoidable given the carrot and stick combination of considerable economic development and ruthlessness that characterized Japan's rule, especially in the last decade of the colony when Japan's expansion across Asia caused a shortage of experts and professionals throughout the empire. Ambitious Koreans found new careers opening to them just as the most oppressive point of this colony's history, as Koreans were commanded not to speak Korean and to change their names, and millions of Koreans were used as mobile human fodder by the Japanese. Koreans came to constitute about half of the hated national police, and young Korean officers joined the aggressive Japanese army in Manchuria. Pro-Japanese aristocrats were rewarded with special titles, and some of Korea's greatest early nationalists and intellectuals, such as Yi Kwang-soo, came out in public in support of Japan's empire. If collaboration was inevitable, its considerable scale was not, nor was it ever fully and frankly debated in South Korea or punished, leaving the problem to fester until 2004, when the government finally launched an official investigation of collaboration, along with the estimates that up to 90% of the pre-1990 South Korean elite had ties to the collaborationist families or individuals. Japanese forces launched their first major anti-guerrilla campaign in April 1932 in Kando, killing anyone who said to be a communist or aiding communists. Many victims were innocent peasants. North Korean sources say that 25,000 died, perhaps an exaggeration, but surely was an unholy slaughter. The experience became the most famous North Korean opera, Sea of Blood, and it happened amid a drastic fall in peasant livelihoods brought on by the depression and collapse of the world economy. Take a look at your dollar bill. You'll see George Washington. Looking up the North Korean equivalent, one will notice on the right side the heroine of Sea of Blood. You also see her etched into a massive tile mural across the Pyongyang Hotel and in many other iconic places in North Korea. The Manchurian Candidate. Kim Il-sung was who organized the first guerrilla unit in that same spring of 1933 was the Manchurian Candidate, master of the measures taken, but he did not make a name for himself until a battle with Dog Ning in September 1933, when Chinese leaders mounted an unusually large attack on this city, aided by two Korean guerrillas companies led by Kim. His units rescued a Chinese commander, Shi Chang-hung, in his battle, and from then on, Kim was a confidant of top Chinese leaders, which saved Kim when he himself was arrested by Chinese comrades on suspicion of being a national traitor. Commander Shi declared that, quote, a great figure like Kim Il-sung could not be a Japanese running dog, and said that he would take his guerrillas and leave the Communist Party if it convicted Kim. Kim took a leading role in trying to forge Sino-Korean cooperatives in the Manchurian guerrilla struggle, helped along by his fluency in Chinese. After the establishment of Manchukuo, around 80% of the anti-Japanese guerrillas and upward of 90% of the members of the Chinese Communist Party were Koreans. By February 1936, a formidable Sino-Korean army had emerged, with Kim commanding the 3rd Division and several Chinese regimental commanders under him. Koreans were still the largest ethnic force in the late 1930s, constituting 80% of two regiments, 50% of another, and so on. By this time, Kim was the, quote, leader of the Korean communists in eastern Manchuria with a great reputation and a high position in the estimation of Han Hong-kao. Quote, Kim Il-sung fought all during 1938 and 1939. Dae-suk-soo wrote, mostly in southern and southeastern Manchuria. There were numerous published accounts of his activities, such as the Daegao raid of April 26, 1938, and his raid into Korea, once again in May 1939. He was not alone, though, working with other Korean guerrilla leaders with their own detachments, such as Chang Yong-gon, Minister of Defense for the Korean War People, Kim Chaek, and Choi Hyun. Kim's reputation was also plumped by the Japanese, whose newspaper featured a conflict between him and the Korean Quislings and the Japanese employed to track him down and kill him, such as Colonel Kim Wok-sok-won, then known as Kanayama Shakugan. He reported to General Nozo Shotoku commander of the Special Kim Detachment of the Imperial Army. Colonel Kim's greatest success came in February 1940 when he killed Yang Jingyu, a famous Chinese guerrilla and close comrade of Kim Il-sung. In April, Nozo's forces captured Kim Hee-sun, thought to be Kim's first wife, and Japanese tried in vain to use her to lure Kim out of hiding and then murdered her. Maida Takashi headed out another Japanese special police unit with many Koreans in it that tracked Kim's guerrillas for months in early 1940. Maida's forces literally caught up with Kim when his guerrillas attacked them on March 13, 1940. After both sides suffered casualties, Kim's group released POWs that they could move faster. Maida pursued him for nearly 2 weeks, stumbling into a trap on March 25th. Kim threw 250 guerrillas at 150 soldiers in Maida's unit, defeating them and killing Maida. 58 Japanese and 17 others attached to the force, and taking 13 prisoners and large quantities of weapons and ammunition. In September 1939, the month when Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II, the Japanese mobilized a, quote, massive punitive expedition consistent of 6 battalions in the Kwantung Army and 20,000 men of the Manchurian Army and police force in a 6-month guerrilla suppression campaign, the main target being led by Kim Il-sung and Cho Hyun. In September 1940, an even larger force embarked on a counterinsurgency campaign against Chinese and Korean guerrillas. The punitive operation was conducted for 1 year and 8 months and until the end of March 1941, and the bandits, excluded those led by Kim Il-sung, were completely annihilated. The bandit leaders were shot to death or forced to submit. In other words, massive counterinsurgency punctuated the last 2 years of the conflict, which lasted until the eve of the German onslaught against the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung's unit had grown to 340 fighters by July 1940, when it again became the target of General Nozo's expeditionary force. But soon many of his comrades were killed, and Kim was forced into small unit operations thereafter. Thousands of guerrillas were wiped out and could be added to the estimates of about 200,000 guerrillas, communist secret society members, and bandits slaughtered by the Japanese going back to the Manchurian incident in 1931. The disunity of the Korean diaspora, ordinary farmers seeking their livelihood, merchants trying to start a business, lesser and greater collaborators with the Japanese, a resistance made up of communist, nationalist, bandits, and criminals, left Kim Il-sung with a conviction: unity above all else and by whatever means necessary. Taking breath literally. From then onward, the North Korean leadership promoted a totalized police, no dissent, no political alternatives, our way or the highway. Almost as soon as they came into power, they put key guerrilla leaders in charge of almost everything. Cho Yong-gun, for example, was installed as head of the main Christian Democratic Party in the North. However lamentable outsiders may find this, it has been a core element of North Korean politics since the 1930s. The dilemma of political means and ends for them is defined by being at war with either Japan or the United States ever since. Nothing is more important than learning to think crudely, Brecht once said. Crude thinking is the thinking of great men. So was the milieu of crisis in which he wrote, and Koreans fought crude, illiberal murderers. Kim Il-sung, Kim Chek, Choi Hyun, and Choi Yong-gun, and about 200 other key Korean leaders were the fortunate survivors of a pitiless campaign that died the hills of Manchukuo with Korean blood. But in 1945, these guerrillas came back to Pyongyang, colonized the regime, and in typical Korean fashion, began intermarrying, producing children, and putting them through elite schools. Their descendants are the power holders of North Korea today. Regardless of Pyongyang's preposterous and ceaseless hagiography, in short, Kim Il-sung is an impeccable pedigree in the resistance. So did his family. His father was jailed for anti-Japanese activities in 1924. He died soon after his release. 2 years later, Kim's middle brother, Col James, reportedly died at the age of 20 in Manchukuo after his arrest in 1935 by the Japanese. Kim's uncle, Chang Chin-sok, elder brother to his mother, was arrested in 1924 and served 13 years in a Japanese prison. The North foregrounds hundreds of similar family stories. Chae To-hook, subsequently a vice marshal of the KPA, lost one of his brothers in a Japanese pacification campaign. 2 others died as guerrillas on the battlefield, and his mother starved to death at a blockaded guerrilla base. Yeosong's father also starved to death in a guerrilla base, even though he was to escape of food supplies. Ye's brother-in-law was executed, and his 2 sisters, part of his guerrilla group, both died of starvation. Extremely malnourished himself, Ye never reached full adult growth. In 1971, Ye, by then a lieutenant general of the KPA, became headmaster of the Mangyeondae Revolutionary School, successor to the school for the offspring of revolutionary martyrs, first established in 1947 for the hundreds of orphans collected by them. The devastation of the Korean War sent many more thousands of children into this parentless heaven and into the leadership. This is the central educational institution for the North Korean power elite and the symbolic crucible for molding the astonishing family state created out of the ashes of 2 devastating wars. The paramount interest of this elite was to have the big army and the full panoply of military equipment that they so sorely lacked in the 1930s. At the founding of the KPA on February 8, 1948, many years later, they changed the founding date to April 25, 1932. The essential features of this garrison state were on full display. Only Kim Il-sung's portrait was put out instead of the usual tandem portraits with Stalin. Kim's speech laid emphasis on the necessity for a self-reliant nation to have its own army. At all times and in all places, our Korean people must take their fate into their own hands and must make all plans and preparations for building a completely self-reliant, independent nation in which they alone are the masters in a government unified by their own hands. The KPA, he said, grew out of the Manchurian guerrilla struggle with a tradition of 100 battles and 100 victories. He made no reference to Soviet help in building the KPA a year later on. The first anniversary of the KPA, Kim was for the first time referred to as Suryang, an ancient Kurogya term meaning supreme or great leader that had been reserved for Stalin until then. This was complete hearsay in the communist world at that time, but it became his title thereafter, down to his death in 1994. The Soviet and Kim Il-sung. After the USSR collapsed in 1991, a picture emerged of Kim Il-sung in a Soviet uniform with some kind of medal on his lapel. Like Ho Chi Minh, Kim had a dark period, quote, whereabouts unknown, in the latter case, 1941 to 45, and when some hard evidence finally turned up of a clear connection to Moscow, it was munched over time and again. In my reading, this information was never balanced with hard facts that we learned long ago in the work of the Soviet dissident Roy Medvedev, for example, that Stalin ordered every last Korean agent in the Comintern shot in the late 1930s and began his many mass deportations of subject populations by moving some 200,000 Koreans from the Soviet Far East to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, tens of thousands of whom died in this forced exodus. In both cases, on the racist grounds that they might be Japanese spies, subject to Japanese influence, or generally unreliable, plus one couldn't tell them apart from Japanese. Kim's relationship with the Soviets turns out to have been quite modest and uneasy. Andrei Lankov has proved, based on Soviet internal materials, that Moscow had no clear-cut plan or determined course of action when they occupied the North in 1945 and proceeded for many months to improvise and get by with the daily ad hoc decisions taken on the ground. With little direction from Moscow, Kim Il-sung was not handpicked by the Russians, but for a number of months was subordinate in Russian minds by the nationalist leader Cho Man-sik. Kim was going to be the defense minister under an interim regime headed by Cho. But by February 1946, Kim was at the top of the power structure, almost by accident in Lankov's words. Even if, however, Stalin had handpicked Kim Il-sung and installed him in Pyongyang as his faithful servant, that would not have been too surprising, since he did that throughout Eastern Europe. Still, it would be entirely biased not to point out that the United States engaged the services of an exiled politician who had spent the previous 35 years in America, named Syngman Rhee, and that the main wartime spy outfit, the Office of Strategic Services, had deposited him in Seoul in an intelligence operation designed to get him there before any other exile leaders, to make an end run around the State Department objections to favoring any particular politicians, especially Rhee, who had angered Foggy Bottom by pretending to be minister plenipotentiary of a Korean provisional government that never governed any Koreans. So that's it. That's that chapter. That's the party of memory. So we're going to do the next chapter, the party of forgetting. We'll get started. It is a matter of wonder, a monument, moment now and here and then gone. Nonetheless, returns as a ghost. And then the man says, I remember, and envies the animal. Cattle grazing and cavorting in a field live in the present. They cannot dissimulate. They cannot be honest. The child playing between the hedges is likewise oblivious of past and present, but his play too will be disturbed, and he will come to understand the words it was, quote, words that cause a man conflict, suffering, satiety, and fulfillment. Thus, quote, to remind him what his existence fundamentally is, an imperfect tense that can never become a perfect one. Gustav Meyrink wrote that knowledge and memory are one and the same thing. A soldier has knowledge of a battle at Hill 79 and memory of it. But Meyrink is not quite right. Knowledge is, of course, about memory, but memories also have histories. They come and go, often without sensing where they come from or where they go. They are unstable, they change, they evolve. They mutate in ways of independent of thought. Temporal and physical dislocations, displacement, oscillations, movement, forward and back, confidence, panic, experiences, acquired and lost, the human memory, recapitulates the lived experiments of the refugee. Michael Foucault's reasoning closely followed Nietzsche's on the inaccessibility of the origins and the discontinuous development of human consciousness, one that acquires experience, forgets, dissembles, remembers, represses, blots out one memory with another in an unsteady progress towards a settled mind of integrity, remembrance, and wisdom. Memory comes down to us through, quote, sedimented layers of previous apprehension and interpretation as people experience history, lodge it in memory, and then rewrite it to suit their needs, particularly where individual complicity in crimes is at stake. Their plastic power preserves the psychic peace at the cost of repression, but it is also a positive trait, a testament of the treating and creative and ingenuity of the species, as Tina Rosenberg put it. Yet people strive against all odds to preserve the sovereignty of the subject, a life narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. The opposite of remembrance or of keeping promises is forgetfulness. It allows us to close the doors, quote, and windows of consciousness for a time. Nietzsche wrote, as an act of faculty, forgetting is, quote, like a doorkeeper, a preserver of psychic order, response, and etiquette. Human beings need forgetting just as its opposite, memory, is an act of will. It requires us, one, to think casually, to compute, to reflect, and to anticipate. And this is a long story of how responsibility originated. To be responsible is to be serious about husbanding memory. Forgetfulness is a matter of will, too, an active and, in the strictest sense, positive faculty of the repression. We humans are weak. We need to forget. However, people cannot but remember which is, quote, burned in. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. Pain is the most powerful aid to mnemonics. Virginia Woolf had the same insight. Trauma confers memory, an underground river of recollection. Here, in essence, is the reason why Koreans remember and Americans forget. The Korean War, more than any other war in modern times, is surrounded by residues and slippages of memory. The Great War's place is indelible in modern memory in annihilating violence, a permanent reminder of the war's carnage. World War II was the good war, an outright victory to be celebrated. Vietnam tore the United States apart. With Korea, there is less a presence than an absence, thus default reflexive American name, quote, the Forgotten War. Its veterans feel neglected and misunderstood. They're also forgotten. South Korean experience a knot of terrible loss, tragedy, bitterness, fate, invisible burdens, and inner negotiation, pushing them down and bending them inward, which they call ban. North Koreans remember a scourge that claimed, on average, at least one member from every family. But here the party of memory, laser focus, burned in remembrance of things past. For years, I rejected the quote, forgotten war rubric. The unknown war seemed much better. But for Americans, Korea is both a forgotten war and a never known war. The war begins to disappear from consciousness as soon as fighting stabilized. The first time it was named, quote, forgotten, to my knowledge, came in May 1951 as the title of an article in U.S. News and World Report. Likewise, as early as 1973, Martha Gellhorn wrote that the consensual amnesia was the American reaction, an almost instant reaction, to the Vietnam War. Television reinforced the forgetting by maintaining a respectful silence, quote, after U.S. troops departed in 1973, even though the suddenly, quote, forgotten war was hardly over. Veterans also decided that this sobriquet fit Korea based on their hard-won experience in the field and their uncomprehending reception when they came home. Now that the war is over, says the chorus in Antigone, forget war, quote. But if war is never over, how can it be forgotten? For Americans, Korea is just one among several wars best forgotten since we are battling only one of four big wars since 1945. Just another transient episode among a myriad of interventions in third world countries that do not bear close examination if one cares about a more prop, but have unsettling ways of coming back to haunt us in Iran, for example, or Guatemala. Yet a survey of information and experience leaves even the most inquiring person with a huge quantity of indigestible stones of knowledge, so as we would rather let our knowledge rest quietly within, like a snake that has swallowed rabbits whole and now lies in the sun and avoids all necessary movement. It is a strange and disturbing thing, this human, all too human failing, because, quote, one would think that history would encourage men to be honest. A civil war. The American perfect tense leads with a complete automaticity toward the dogma that the Korean War was started in 1950 by Stalin and Kim Il-sung and ended in 1953, whether as victory, stalemate, or defeat, depends on your partisan politics. And its sobriquet ever since has been, quote, the forgotten war. But let us assume that all we need to know is the alpha, Kim Il-sung, aided by Stalin, pushed the button on June 25th. And that's how this war started. We successfully contained him and restored South Korea, the Omega. A nagging problem still remains, unlike Hitler invading Poland, Toho attacking South Pearl Harbor, and Saddam invading Kuwait. Koreans invaded Korea. What do we make of that? In the midst of the terrible crisis in December 1950, that ineluctably followed upon the American decision to, quote, liberate the North. Another view surfaced, that of Richard Stokes, the British Minister of Works, who instituted a paradox. The 38th parallel decision in 1945, taken unilaterally by the Americans, was, quote, the invitation to such a conflict as has in effect arisen. In the American Civil War, the Americans would never have tolerated for a single moment the setting up of an imaginary line between the forces of North and South, and there can be no doubt as to what would have been their reaction if the British intervened in force on behalf of the South. This parallel is a close one, because in America, the conflict was not merely between two groups of Americans, but was between two conflicting economic systems, as in the case in Korea. Ever since 1950, this Civil War analogy has been like a Rumpelstiltskin for official American view that Kim committed international aggression. Say it and the logic collapses, the interpretation loses its power. But Stokes carried his argument one step further, not just a civil war, but a war between two conflicting social and economic systems. Stokes happened to have been right. The longevity of this conflict finds its reason in the essential nature of the war. But the thing we need to know is, first, it was a civil war, a war fought primarily by Koreans from conflicting social systems for Korean goals. It did not last 3 years, but had a beginning in 1932 and has never ended. In the early 1970s, when the Vietnam War was clearly lost, even an anti-communist scholar such as Adam Ulam, who in the 1990s called Korea Stalin's War, could reflect that the North's attack against the 38th parallel was no different than Mao's legions crossing the Yangtze into South China. And we can add Hanoi's regular armies rolling out of the Central Highlands in 1975. The civil war in China and Vietnam ended with infantry invasions, and Korea would have too if we think of June 1950 as an end to the decades of inter-Korean conflict, a denouement instead of a beginning. For Americans, a mere discrete encapsulation limits this war to the time frame of June 1950 to July 1953. The construction relegates all that we went before history, into mere prehistory. June 25th is original sin. All that comes after is postbellum. It also presumed to demarcate the period of active American involvement before June 1950. It is Sigmund Rhee against Kim Il-sung back or controlled by Stalin and or Mao. After July 1953, it is Rhee against the same people, his fledgling republic ever under threat. The construction focuses on the bright glare of our attention on the question is who started the war, on the presupposition that the correct answer to this question furnishes the answer to all other questions. What is highlighted here obscures all that went before and all that came after, placing it in the shadows of irrelevance. In the manner a wrongly conceived and never known civil conflict disappears before our very eyes as an American construction that only an American would believe, but Americans' amour propre remains firmly intact. The American focus on, quote, who started it is a political and often ideological position, a point of honor that abstracts from and makes easy and comprehensible the politically shaped verdicts that began with Washington's official story of June 25th, 1990. The Korean War was and is a civil war. Only this conception can account for the 100,000 lives lost in the South before June 1950 and the continuity of the conflict down to the present, in spite of assumptions that Moscow's puppets in Pyongyang would surely collapse after the USSR met oblivion in 1991. It is therefore instructive to see what Thucydides, the first philosopher of war, had to say about fratricidal conflict. Perhaps the most famous line in his book, War is a Stern Teacher, quote, come from the Civil War in Conquera. War is a stern teacher, so revolutions broke out in city after city. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression is now regarded as the courage one would expect to find a party member to think of the future and wait, as merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was still just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides means that one was totally unfitted for action. Fantastical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. The passage fits the Korean Civil War with no necessity to dot I's or cross T's, and it explains the continuing blight on the Korean mind drawn by that war, just like a doctor drawing blood to understand the Korean War from all sides. It is still to go to jail in the North and to risk oblivion in the now and finally democratic South. It also fits the American Civil War, by far the most devastating of all American wars to Americans, but one that happened long ago, enough ago, so that Americans have no idea what it means to have warfare sweeping back and forth across the national territory, or to have brother pitted against brother. Okay, so give me 1 second. Glad you could join us today. Okay, let's continue. Oh, what a literary war. This was Paul Fussel's title for the Great War. It would never occur to anyone to say that about Korea, if this war exists. In American literature, it is usually wallpaper for people who may or may not have fought there, but came of age in the 1950s. From this war came nothing like Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, or Michael Hare's Dispatches. Neither a victory like World War II, nor with defeat like Vietnam. It struck a glancing blow at young people who looked up to their parents who fought in this big war and yet had yet to encounter Vietnam and seem ultimately to have been bewildered by Korea, not to have seen the war in its fullness and quickly to have passed it by if they didn't fight in it. The war was and remains, after all, a stark counterpart to the Acheson 1950s, the easy, quote, I like Ike, years of nearly full employment, Hollywood or in Technicolor, and James Dean in full adolescent sulk, TV in its Ozzy and Harry phase of light family entertainment, Detroit turning out brilliantly painted and chromed lead seats, cars with rocket-like tail fins, and busty Marilyn Monroe front bumpers. It was all there by 1955. The next year, Newt Gingrich once nominated the apex of the American dream. The nostalgia elide segregation, a stultifying conformity, and of course the Korean War. But most young people loved these years to experience Elvis and Little Richard and Fats Domino when nothing like them had ever appeared in the horizon of white folks with every fond hope for the future. It's just another reason why the war got buried. James Salter's beautiful memoir, Burning the Days, briefly recounts his 6 months in Korea, substitute for World War II, since he got his pilot's wings just as the war ended. The memoir might be a script for The Bridges at Toko Rhee, probably the best known Hollywood film of the war. The action takes place mostly in Japan, in a narrative line in World War II, and Toko Rhee is the Japanese pronunciation of a Korean village. It appeared when Hollywood felt it besieged by McCarthyism and neatly avoided all the controversies of this war. Like the country and the people leave not a bare trace on Salter's mind. Likewise, the country and the people leave not a bare trace on Salter's mind. He remembers cold winter mornings, anonymous Korean women serving him bunja orange juice at breakfast, or not, in which case they have no bunga. Headings for his bombing runs in the north, the girls at Miyoshi's in Japan. There remains with me not the name of a single battle of the time or even general other than Van Fleet. When he discussed in Korea, what he discussed governed in Korea, he also kept hidden because it was so hard to articulate a deep attachment, deeper than anything I had known, to all that happened and to the self he became based on the risking of everything. It was a great voyage of this life, the burning days of youth, but it just happened to have happened in Korea. There are not many American memoirs of this war, but nearly all of them follow a Toko Rhee narrative. Korea is a never-known nightmare to be escaped in one piece. Japan is civilized, beautiful, rich, with petite culture only to be admired, not to mention the floor shows of Ginza, the golf courses. Philip Root's indignation appears at first to re-inhabit the territory of his collegiate days at Bucknell, a return to the terrain of his novel, Goodbye Columbus. The Midwest Marcus Messner, a butcher's son from Newark, goes off to Winsburg College near Cleveland, studies the usual literary suspect, fumbles with girls in the back seat of cars, and ends up on the dean's list, his shit list. Korea beckons. Roth's novelistic treatment of the war he lived through does not go beyond the tropes and stereotypes of the time. Swarms of Chinese, snow wave after wave of Chinese, more snow, 1,000 screaming Chinese soldiers come swarming down on you, and it's still snowing. What was the war about? It remains a mystery. So the Chinese swarm and the snow falls. But Roch's climactic coldest winter comes in the Winsburg blizzard of 51, ostensibly a panty raid gone wild that gets him kicked out of college unfairly. The Korea awaits him. The war is reduced in the Chinese hordes and some barbed wire on a spiny ridge in central Korea. But there his young life is snuffed out, and his ghost reflects on what his father, a simple butcher, had tried to teach him, the incomprehensible way one's most banal, incidental, even comical choices achieve the most disproportionate result. Roth interrupts his narrative, however, with a discourse on memory as the all-embracing medium in which I am sustained to myself and the receptacle for life, who could have imagined that one would have forever to remember every moment of life down to its tiny component. It slowly dawns on the reader that Roth is writing posthumously. He is dead, and his afterlife is experienced in memories, an imperishable fingerprint of an afterlife unlike anyone else's. It is an afterlife, but it is his own, uniquely in a permanent condition of memory upon memory. Nothing but memory, he is right. Memory is synonymous with oneself. His memory is immortal. The war is not. It recedes into oblivion. No other American journalist so fully inhabited the time and ranged so widely from the seriousness of the best and the brightest and courageous reporting from Vietnam to brainstorming with the Chicago Bulls on the New England Patriots than David Halberstam. What other journalist so deeply explored the history through which he lived? Philip Roth and Dan Dillo do this in fiction, but who else in nonfiction? Whether it was in Saigon or the ballpark, David was the one. I met David twice. First, when I invited him to the University of Chicago, and next when we spent an afternoon talking about the Korean War. He left a message saying he was doing a book on the war and wanted to talk. I was flabbergasted that I could call back his published Manhattan number, and he picked up. He was charming, gracious, vital, engaging, and we didn't see eye to eye about this war. Then came coldest April in 2007, when he died en route to the interview, the legendary quarterback Y.A. title. A shopping capricious, tragic auto accident stilled his resonant journalist voice for the first time since his high school days. Although the Korean War ended only a few years before Vietnam, it is as if the generation intervened between these two wars. Type Korean War on the Amazon website, and a few books come up that are still in print, usually by veterans of military historians. On Amazon.com, a person named Edmund Burke listed, quote, the 10 best books on the Korean War. All but one are by Americans or Westerners, and that one is by a novel by Han Jin. Koreans presumably do not write about their own war. Most of the books are decades old, and no books by scholars make the list. Browse a library and you will find rack after rack on the Vietnam War and just one or two for the Korean War. Was Halberstam actually counted? What war Halberstam actually counted them in a public library in Key West was 88 books on the Vietnam War, 4 on Korea. It took years of research to find out that Marilyn Monroe was discovered during the Korean War and dubbed, quote, Miss Flamethrower, or that Margaret Bourke White took hundreds of photos for life, not just of the war and the soldiers, but of the unknown guerrilla war in the South. It was only when Picasso died, I learned, in the fine point of his obituary, about his mural massacre in Korea, in the style of Guernica, MASH remains an all-time popular TV series because it may be set in Korea, but it's really about the Vietnam War. It has that sensibility. So it is to Halberstam's great credit that he did his last book on this war. Of course, we all know it wouldn't have been close to his last book. David Halberstam would have been the first to say that if someone thinks that Ted Williams' 406 batting average in 1941 is not awe-inspiring, well, you might not necessarily want to talk baseball with that person, especially the coldest winter, in full passages that strike a historian in the same way. For example, that Dean Acheson made a, quote, colonial gaffe at the press club in 1950 by leaving South Korea out of his defense perimeter, or that Kim Il-sung was the dependent plaything of the Russian or Chinese, or that the invasion of the North in the fall of 1950 was MacArthur's idea, or that the June 1950 invasion started this conflict. Exactly 2 Korean names from the South show up in his book. Syngman Rhee, the president, and Paik San-yup, the all-purpose former general, trotted out for every prominent visiting journalist since the war ended, who fought alongside Imperial Japan, and was for decades a close associate of Japanese war criminals such as Sakaka Ryoichi and assorted unrepentant Nazis. Halberstam mentions the U.S. military government from 1945 to 1948, which deeply shaped post-war Korean history in one sentence. There is absolutely nothing on the atrocious massacres of this war or the American incendiary bombing campaign. Instead, Korea is a, quote, shrimp among whales, a stereotype from 1900, an insignificant country with a bunch of leaders who it seems are hard to take seriously, and so on. The Coldest Winter is one of the best in a peculiar but common American genre, accounts of the war that evince almost no knowledge of Korea or its history, barely get past 2 or 3 Korean names, focus on the American experience in a war where Koreans and Chinese were much more numerous, and fail to question the accumulated baggage of the 1950 stereotypes about the good guys and bad guys. Nonetheless, this genre exercises a strong influence in the United States, perhaps a subliminal one, in that extensive knowledge of the war is not required. Perhaps a hegemonic one is that well-known analysis easily performed its logic in a few sentences. Not many writers were better or more perspicacious guides to the George H. Bush administration and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan than Hendrik Hetzberg, the New Yorker. He recently wrote that 2 out of 5 big wars since 1945 were good ones. Korea and the Gulf War 1991, because they were legitimate in their origins and scrupulous in their execution. Both were fought in response to armed aggression across international borders, and both American leaders resisted powerful political pressure to expand in its objective to include the destruction and conquest of the regime responsible for original aggression. The reader can judge how well these generalizations hold up as the book unfolds. Acheson's press club speech was the opposite of an ill-considered gaffe. Instead, it unlocks key aspects of U.S. policy toward Korea before the war. Why did he not include Korea in his perimeter? The best answer is that Acheson wanted to keep secret the American commitment to Korea's defense. Acheson implied that should an attack come there, the United States would take the problem to the UN Security Council, which is what Dean Rusk had secretly recommended to him nearly a year before the war in July 1949, and exactly what Acheson did when the war erupted. In the many drafts leading up to his speech, South Korea was consistently seen as a direct American responsibility along with Japan, but Acheson did not want to say this publicly, lest Sigmund Rhee be emboldened to start the war. That is also why he blocked tanks and an air force for the ROK. Interestingly, when the North Koreans commented on this speech, they had South Korea included in the defense perimeter. Why? Because for weeks there was no official transcript of the speech, and the North Koreans probably read the New York Times, which in the Sunday Week in Review section after the speech had also included Korea in the defense line. In the end, it all worked out beautifully for Acheson, who was seeking ambiguity and trying to keep both the communists and volatile allies, such as Sigmund Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek, guessing about what the United States would do if South Korea or Taiwan were attacked. The British War Office said in the December 1949 estimate that the Northern forces would have little difficulty in winning a war, and, quote, on the question of aggression, there can be, quote, no doubt whatever that their ultimate object is to overrun the South. The Americans had thought that the South could defend itself, the War Office says, but recently, quote, they have been coming around to our way of thinking. This was an accurate reflection of Acheson's suppositions. As for Stalin, thanks to him, Kim Philby and other spies, he was reading Acheson's sex secrets with his breakfast and had no reason to pay attention to speeches for public consumption. The Coldest Winter is best at examining the major American protagonists, though deftly written portraits Acheson, Truman, Kennan, MacArthur, and especially Pinky MacArthur, his mother. It was the age of Acheson. Halberstrands correctly said he dominated the basic decisions about the war and could do so because he had a consistency of one, Harry Truman. Halberstran's subtle portrait of George Kennan is one of the best in the literature and explains why. He was the only top American leader who understood that invading North Korea was a disastrous idea. He catches MacArthur well, but a bit too perfectly, overestimating his influence. MacArthur made no decision that was central to the war except his fateful one to split his army corps as they marched into the north. The Incheon landing, which Halberstrand presents as a brilliant, daring gamble and a total surprise to the North Koreans, was neither. A Pentagon war plan issued in mid-June 1950 prefigured it, and a host of captured documents show Pyongyang knew it was coming, and by the end of August, if not earlier, but could do little about it. Halberstrand brings into focus the view that many Americans, veterans whom he clearly enjoyed interviewing about this puzzling, gray, and very distant conflict, a war that went on, seemingly without hope or resolution, about which most Americans preferred to know as little as possible. It was a war, he thought, orphaned by history, true in the 1950s perhaps, but a full shelf of books by historians in the United States and all around the world claimed it decades ago. Had Halberstrand read this work seriously, he could not have written The Coldest Winter. Had someone written a book like this about the Vietnam War, he would have been the first to criticize it. Rather, his book illustrates the war's impact on the particular generation, those too young for World War II, and a school in which Korea raged and professionally engaged by the time Vietnam became the issue. In the same way that no archival document could ever convince me of Richard Nixon's essential goodness. No historian was going to tell David Halberstam that Dean Acheson and Harry Truman were not the good guys and MacArthur not the author of the war's essential failure. Halberstam ends part one with this from Acheson. Quote, we sat armed around like paralyzed rabbits while MacArthur carried out this nightmare. Here we witnessed nothing more than the brilliance of Acheson's ventriloquy and dissembling. Melvin Horowitz was a bright young doctor assigned to a MASH unit near the front of 1951 to 52, and his loving letters to his wife reflect his complicated experience. His original image of the Far East, formed by Hollywood movies, was about places where terrorists lurked in the dark, shadowed alleys. Korea existed somewhere between an occupied Japan that he could enjoy and appreciate, and American stereotypes of Chinese laundrymen. Boysen make he with rubber. He wrote about some sandals, the son, honorific, of course, Japanese. Like most other Americans, in the last 2 years of the war, his contact with Koreans were minimal. Houseboys employed full-time for $2.25 a month, maids, wounded ROK soldiers. Muted by the language barrier, he rode through the countryside like a tourist, enjoying the beauty of the mountains and rice paddies and the glint of red pepper drying on a golden detached roof. The one city that escaped the war, Busan, was for him a nightmare of refugees, gangs of ragged children and kids pimping, me pimpo, nice girl, blowjob. Like most of the soldiers he knew, especially the pain and death along a front that rarely moved more than a few miles. Syngman Rhee, the George Washington of Korea, to American politicians, was a, quote, tyrant and fascist. As Chang, Korea was yet one more war that shouldn't have happened. Salter, Roth, Halberstam, and Horowitz are markers for a generation that will pass away like the rest of us, and after that, no American will again bury this distant war in the nostalgia of young men and their formative experiences. Gregory Henderson was one of the very few among the millions of Americans who served Korea, both before and during the 6 million in the war years alone, to have been moved by the country, to learn the language and culture, to have made of it a second home, first as a diplomat, then as a scholar. His Politics of Vortex remains one of the best books on 20th century Korea, and is particularly acute on those years himself experiences. Everyone knew everyone else in Seoul, a city so centralized. That was its core of his vortex. Henderson's job was to get to know the elites. Even better, on behalf of his country, his eye fell on anomalies that others missed. For example, Japanese military service of the high command of the ROK army, a quiet pride they took in having fought the emperor and remained loyal. Park Chung-hee served a different emperor, Puyi, the titular leader of Manchuria, for whom Park received a gold watch. Henderson likened the ROK to the southern way of life in the United States, an apt analogy given the prevalence of landed estates served by multitudes of peasant tenants. If this was hardly Athens, the North was much like its opposite, steelier, more Spartan, more hard-bitten, and more ideologic, and yes, less yielding and opportunistic. Through Chinese eyes, in contrast to the ephemeral traces Korea made on American minds, Ha-Jin's novel, War Trash, rings true on every page, a closely observed and much pondered experience. An interested, fair, discerning observer, so shocked by what he saw, he embraces the odd mass of humanity clustered in Korea during the war. His protagonist unit crossed the Yalu to find empty land, with at least 4/5 of the houses level to the ground. The farther south they went, even fewer houses remained. The image of a blind woman in a roughly white dress picking through garbage dump, a toddler strapped to her back, remains with him forever as a sign of human resilience. Even amid the blasted landscape, Korean women sang songs, sometimes for hours in the evening, and remained fond of cosmetics. That most had a pouch of stuff to make up their faces. The few Chinese women over 40 bother wearing skirts, let alone makeup. He came upon a prison camp holding hundreds of women guerrillas. Women sang there too. Their voices transported me to reveries. He noticed the Chinese and North Korean soldiers paid for what they took from civilization, and North Korean soldiers paid for what they took from civilians, whereas South Korean troops just took it. How is it that a Chinese foot soldier sees these things, but Americans apparently didn't? Then after he was captured, he wondered why American doctors and nurses were so kind to him. Onjin recreates fictionally the notorious episode where North Korean POWs captured Brigadier General Francis T. Dodd on May 8, 1952, during riots on Koji Island. North Koreans in the camps looked more like highly organized militias than POWs. Ha-Jin thought women were their communications channel to guerrillas on the island and to their superiors in the north. The Korean People's Army colonel named Rhee had fought for many years against the Japanese in Manchukuo and spoke fluent Chinese. He and others explained that Kim Il-sung had ordered them to open a second front inside the camps. The POWs spit out bitterness at General Dodd. Why did American soldiers make North Korean soldiers strip naked after their captors? Why did their jets erase villages after Dodd was released? American forces used flamethrowers to retake the camp, leaving 77 dead among the POWs. In 1987, I was able to interview Pak Chang-uk in Pyongyang, a double amputee, who rose from his chair for a standing position by throwing his trunk forward and leveraging his wooden legs under his weight. He provided a blow-by-blow description of the Dodd capture and the subduing of North Korean POWs in Camp 76 in a presentation so striking that he seemed ready to fight it all out again. After the war, he sired 3 daughters and a son, the eldest daughter an architect and the son of a railway engineer. So that's it. Those are 2 chapters. Let's get started. We're going to discuss the party of memory and the party of forgetting. So this is the insult session. The hateful, jealous, racist whites of Washington. They are anti-third world, racist, jealous, hateful Americans. Their actions in Korea, everything describes them to have made huge errors, huge miscalculations that a government like the United States with quote-unquote prestige and credibility is not supposed to be making. They are not becoming of a superpower for making these ridiculously incorrect decisions. Okay, we're going to talk about basically the party of memory. Okay, so basically we talked a lot about Japan. Prime Minister Abe, basically Abe was, a part of a war criminal. He was, related to a war criminal. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe related to a war criminal. His 1992 book. So Yoshiaki Yoshimi walked into a military library and found many such documents just sitting on the shelf. His 1995 book, Comfort Women, Sexual Slavery in the Japanese Military During World War II, is now a standard source, but his findings were also a direct impedance on Foreign Minister Kono Yohei's 1993 apology, citing that many were recruited against their will through coaxing and coercion. Abe essentially repudiated this statement. So Comfort Women, it was part of the Japanese occupation of Manchukuo, part of the Japanese occupation of Korea. Basically, Comfort Women, there's a book about it if you want to read it. Sexual slavery in the Japanese military history during World War II. Dr. Yoshiaki and other historians determined that somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 women were in the system by the time it was fully established, the vast majority of them Koreans. Okay, so up to 200,000, mostly Korean women, were sex slaves to the Japanese. This is, George Bush. George Bush is meeting with Shinzo Abe. This is a racist American government. They're just racist, despicable scoundrels. Now call them snake-like scoundrels. And that is what the American government is. Okay, so basically, many were lured or tricked into service. These comfort women, these sex slaves of the Japanese and the Americans, right? The Americans had them as sex slaves as well. Their prostitution, their white pimps of the U.S. government, the Congress, their pimps, had sex slaves. But they were sex slaves to the Japanese. They were sex slaves to the Japanese. It is difficult to think of a more sordid transgression by a modern army than this one, trampling the lives and decency of such a multitude of racially despised women. So basically, you can't think of a more sordid transgression by a modern army than this one. Just like the United States. The United States is the only one that we can compare the Japanese army to in this sordid transgression, which trampled the lives and decency of such a multitude of racially despised women. Okay, so Korean women in the Japanese mental state were racially despised. Okay, that is what makes this all the more painful for the Korean people and for the Korean women. And the United States government, they're racist, hateful, anti-third world rights, help the Japanese create more and more prostitution among the Koreans. So basically about 187,000 soldiers of Korea and an additional 22,000 sailors served during the war and also availed themselves of comfort stations. Okay, the South Korean army then set up a similar comfort station during the Korean War, sometimes used women and kidnapped from the North. Many sex slaves were utterly ruined individuals, dared not return to their families, and thus had no alternative but to continue working the feeded brothels alongside U.S. military bases in Japan, Okinawa, Korea, and the Philippines. So you can see the Koreans, they couldn't escape this thing. Okay, there were hundreds and thousands of Korean soldiers that served the Japanese. Okay, many Koreans joined the Japanese military, 187,000 plus 22,000 sailors, almost 200,000 Korean soldiers were in the Japanese army. That was the South Korean soldiers. These were all South Koreans. Okay, they used women kidnapped from the North. Many of them brought women kidnapped from the North and put them as sex slaves in the Japanese sex camps. Okay, the South Korean army then set a similar comfort system during the Korean War, sometimes using women kidnapped from the North. Many sex slaves were utterly ruined individuals, dare not return to their families, and thus had no alternative but to continue working in the feeded brothels. This was just an absolute, just a break of morality, just an absolute despicable scoundrel whites of Washington to allow this stuff in South Korea and to allow this to go on shows Washington what it does when you're not looking. They will put you in a state of sexual slavery if you're a third world woman. So watch the dangerous whites of Washington. Okay, so if for once Mr. B basically declined to say that sexual slavery happened during the Japanese World War. They declined to say the Japanese occupation of Manchukuo had sexual slavery. He was wrong. He was wrong. It was widespread. If for once Mr. B could put himself in the shoes of a young woman, fooled into a job by taking 40 or 50 soldiers a day, held as prisoner for months or years, given only bare subsistence living, he would drop to his knees and beg forgiveness. Scholarship on the subject, almost always done by women, illustrates the awful life chances, family catastrophes, and casual degradations that led women into prostitution in East Asia or anywhere else. Okay, so B would drop to his knees if he knew what this meant to the Korean ladies. He would drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness. The whites of Washington helped prostitution in Southeast Asia. They helped it in Bangkok, Thailand. It's still there. They helped it in Saigon and Vietnam. They helped it in China, and they helped it in Korea. They're racist, snake-like scoundrels, anti-third world, hateful, jealous whites, and that's how they treated the Korean ladies. Prime Minister Abe's fumbling and craven performance took place on a national holiday in Korea, sparking the countrywide uprising against Japanese colonial rule that began on March 1st, 1919. March 1st is also the day in 1932 that Japan chose to inaugurate Manchukuo after seizing northwest China. Okay, so basically, Prime Minister Abe's fumbling and craven performance, basically there was an uprising against Japanese colonial rule because of this sex slavery thing. That's an important thing to know, right? The Koreans weren't quiet. The United States should have known that before they started sex slaves themselves and prostitution rings in Southeast Asia themselves. But they didn't acknowledge it, right? Washington always makes the wrong decision. And prostitution was a wrong decision for the hateful, jealous racists of Washington. Okay, Americans shouldn't comfort themselves and feel unconnected to all this, or point out how awful the Japanese are compared to the Germans. Okay, we are the ones who organized a unilateral occupation of Japan, provided it with remarkably soft peace, refused war reparations of its near neighbors, and put people like Kishi back in power. Okay, Americans also sometimes appear oblivious to wounds, the empire that are still raw in Korea, and haunt the present-day relations with Japan. So the United States loves to point out that Koreans are overly sensitive about Japan. Let your white ladies get raped and prostitutes, and whores, and then talk, white man. You're a despicable scoundrel, whites of Washington. So let's keep going. Orders and beginnings. So after the beginning, for his genealogy of the morals, to the Bible, and 2 millennia of misinterpretations of its teaching. The beginning for Korean War was in 1931 to 32, after Japanese forces invaded northeast provinces of China and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. So, Korean War began 1931 to 32. By the mid-1930s, the man who took Nam Dae-geur's Kim Il-sung was a well-known and formidable leader of the guerrillas. Remember, Kim Il-sung, huge man, huge liberating, communist liberating leader of North Korea. This Manchurian crucible produces the two most important leaders of post-war Korea, Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee, and several leaders of post-war Japan. Okay, so this is tracking down some, among the Koreans tracking down and killing Korean and Chinese guerrillas was Tang Tamagami's Kim Sok-won, who commanded the 38th Parallel in the summer of 1939. Okay, the Manchurian Crucible produced Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee, the two leaders of North and South Korea. To the North Koreans, it is less the Japanese than the Korean Quislings that matter. They're blood enemies. So remember, the North Korea, they find blood enemies of the Japanese. Remember that, just always remember North Korea, Pyongyang, and Japan are arch enemies because of the way the Japanese treated the Korean people. North Korea stood firm, due to their despicable behavior by the whites of Washington, their, allies in Japan. Whereas South Korea has acquiesced to these are war crimes that you can't do anything about because the United States would not prosecute them. During the Korean War, this was barely known to Americans. Okay, so the North Korean, it is less Japanese than the Korean Quislings. They essentially saw the war in 1950 as a way to settle the hash of top command of South Korean army, nearly all of whom had served the Japanese during the Korean War. This was barely known to Americans, and when known, was deemed to be of dubious import, because by then Japan was our ally. Okay, so 1950, basically South Korean army, all of the South Korean army had served the Japanese, they're blood enemies. The North Koreans are blood enemies, and they were deemed to be dubious import because Japan was our ally. So whatever the South Koreans said, it didn't matter because Japan was our ally. That is not of matter what we think, however, but what they think. The Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 is akin to the Nazi occupation of France in the way it dug in deeply, and it has gnawed at the national consciousness ever since. So the U.S. government, when it's Nazi incursions in Europe, then you gotta be very sensitive because they're racist, jealous, hateful, anti-third world whites. They hated the Korean people, and that's why they wouldn't accept it as a Nazi occupation by Japan. Okay, so basically that's, that it dug deeply into the national consciousness ever since. After every other characteristic attached to this regime, communist, nationalist, rogue state, evil enemy, it was first of all and above all else an anti-Japanese entity. So whatever you say about North Korea, whatever the United States propaganda is about North Korea, it is an anti-Japanese enemy. It is an anti-Japanese entity. It is an anti-Japanese entity. And is it allowed to be an anti-Japanese entity? That is the question. Of course it is. They raped, they prostituted, they murdered, they tortured. You need an anti-Japanese entity in China and Korea. And they are totally justified in having this. So the propaganda of the United States is a hateful anti-Korean propaganda by the U.S. Racist, hateful, jealous whites of Washington. So that's that. So let's, keep going. We're going to talk. So we talked a little bit about Japan, imperial lengths, the measures taken, the imperial lengths, the Manchurian candidate. There were a few comments here. Basically, careful scholarship in recent years made possible by the availability of new Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Soviet documentation, and by the hard labors and open minds of younger generations of historians, has now made clear that the Koreans formed the vast majority of resistors to the Japanese takeover of Manchuria, native home for the rulers of the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911. So remember that Korea was a huge part of the Chinese Civil War. They helped to defend the Chinese mainland from the Japanese imperialists. And that's a huge thing to know. This is all kind of, woven into American deceit and fraud in their history books. So remember that. Now it was ever fully and frankly debated in South Korea. Nor was it, so basically pro-Japanese, Koreans were forced to become pro-Japanese. they were either tortured with, just psychological torture, or they were humiliated, they were murdered. Whatever it was, they were forced to be pro-Japanese. If the collaboration was inevitable, its considerable scale was not, nor was it ever fully and frankly debated in South Korea or punished, leaving the problem to fester until 2004, when the government finally launched an official investigation of collaboration, along with estimates that upward of 90% of pre-1990 South Korean elite had ties to collaborationist families and individuals. So basically, you needed to punish this collaboration by this South Korea, the Koreans with the Japanese, but it was never punished. Bruce Cummings is very clearly saying this needed to be punished, but it was never punished, and South Korea let it go, creating this lingering hate of the Japanese in the Korean consciousness. After the establishment of Manchukuo, around 80% of the anti-Japanese guerrillas and upward of 90% of the members of the Chinese Communist Party were Korean. Okay, so remember, the anti-Japanese Koreas, the China's invasion by Japan, Korea was huge in the resistance. Okay, remember that. Mao was very aware of who did work for him, who were the, soldiers that were making sure that were, for the revolution and were friends of the revolution. And the Koreans were right there, right next to, the Red Army, the People's Liberation Army, not the Red Army, that's the Soviet Army, the People's Liberation Army, they were right there next to them. Okay, by February 1936, a formidable Sino-Korean army had emerged, with Kim commanding the 3rd Division and several Chinese regimental commanders under him. Okay, so basically, the Koreans, Kim Il-sung was the first commander of the 3rd Division and several Chinese regimental commanders in the Chinese Revolution. So remember that that's an important thing. Okay, so Koreans were the largest ethnic force in the Chinese army. Okay, Kim threw 250 guerrillas. Okay, so remember Maeda. Okay, Maeda and Kim had a rivalry. Japanese Maeda was going around to hunt for Kim Il-sung. He hunted him, he pursued him, and finally on March 25th, he was lured into a trap by Kim. Kim threw 250 guerrillas at 150 soldiers and Maeda units, defeated them and killed Maeda. 58 Japanese and 17 others attached to the force, and then took 13 prisoners and, emptied munitions of Japan. So that was a huge victory for Kim Il-sung. Remember, Kim Il-sung is a really, really, just like Mao, Kim Il-sung is the North Korean Mao Zedong. He is an extremely big military genius. He's a military genius. He has succeeded very well in bringing the North Korean people to a level of, just resistance to American imperialism, the American racist, despicable scoundrels, they're hateful, jealous anti-Third World whites. He has helped to keep them at bay. However lamentable outsiders may find this, excuse me, it has been a core element of North Korean politics since the 1930s. The dilemma of political means and ends for them is defined by being at war with neither Japan or the United States ever since. Okay, so North Korean consciousness, with all of what they face, they have always been at war with the United States or Japan because of the way they were treated, because of the resistance to the Japanese invasion of China, and their need to be close to China to fend off Japanese sexual slavery, Japanese, bacteriologic studies, Japanese torture, all of which were probably put there by the United States of America. The race, hateful, jealous whites probably gave the Japanese these techniques to torture the Korean people and the Chinese people. So Kim Il-sung, Kim Chaek, Cho Yan, Cho Yan-gon, and about 200 other key Korean leaders were the fortunate survivors of a pitiless campaign that dyed the hills of Manchukuo with Korean blood. Okay, so these are the survivors. Remember, Kim Il-sung, regardless of Pyongyang's preposterous and ceaseless hagiography, Bruce Cummings describes a hagiography in which they embellish the accomplishment of Kim Il-sung. But he still says, regardless of those embellishments, Kim Il-sung has an impeccable pedigree in the resistance. Okay, he's an impeccable leader in the resistance. So you have to admit that and say the United States is avoiding addressing an impeccable resistance to Japanese imperialism and American aggressive intent in Asia where they do not belong. Okay, so basically that was that. Okay, so finally, only Kim Il-sung's portrait is put out. So basically many years later, the founding date, the essential features of this garrison were on full display. The elite and the KPA on February 8th, 1948 put on display. Kim Il-sung's portrait was put out instead of the tandem portraits with Stalin. Kim's late speech on the necessity for a self-reliant nation to have its own army at all times In all places, our Korean people must take their fate into their own hands and must make all plans and preparations for building a completely self-reliant, independent nation in which they are their masters and a government unified by their hands. Kim was for the first time referred to as Suryang, the ancient Goguryeo term, meaning supreme or great leader that had been reserved for Stalin until then. This was a complete hearsay to the communist world at that time, but it became his title thereafter down to his death in 1994. So Kim was a revered leader. Remember that as an important fact. The Soviets and Kim Il-sung. Okay, so basically, Stalin didn't want Kim Il-sung. Okay, the information was never balanced. In the work of Soviet dissident Roy Medved, Stalin ordered the last Korean regiment in the Comintern shot in the late 1930s. Okay, he did mass deportations of Koreans from the Soviet Far East to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and thousands died on that exportation. It was a racist grounds for which he did this. Stalin was racist. Okay, they thought that they might be Japanese spies, subject to Japanese influence, or generally unreliable. Plus, one couldn't tell them apart from the Japanese. The typical Western racism. The whites of the West are racist, hateful scoundrels, hateful, jealous whites. Okay, so that was that. And basically, that's it. Still, it would not be entirely biased to point out that the United States engaged in the services of an exiled politician who had spent the previous 35 years. So complaints about basically Kim Il-sung from the United States reflect just look at your own leaders. Remember, look at who you installed, Syngman Rhee. Okay, the main wartime spy outfit, the Office of Strategic Service, has deposited him in Seoul as an intelligence operation designed to get him there before any other exile leaders, to make an end run around the State Department objection to favoring any particular politicians, especially Rhee, who had angered Foggy Bottom by pretending to be minister plenipotentiary of a Korean provisional government that was never governed by Koreans. So basically, the United States complains about other rulers, but they put a fascist dictator in power who couldn't be trusted, and they trusted him, and then they caused, they made a big mistake, a miscalculation, for which they are, criminal whites. They are hateful, jealous, anti-third world racists. Okay, so basically, we're going to do Party of Forgetting. Okay, that's an important one. Basically, okay, so it's important to understand, experiences, forgetting, dissembles, remembers, represses, blots out memory with another. This is the development of human consciousness. Okay, all of these things develop human consciousness. Memory is laid down through sedimented layers of previous apprehension and interpretation as people experience history, lodge it in memory, and so forth. Okay, so it's important to understand the formation of memory and why the United States doesn't form memory. Okay, because they never have negative experiences. Okay, their hardware and their slaughter campaigns result in death and devastation for the third world, but they sit nice and lavish in Washington and watch their technology do destruction, so they never have negative feelings. And so when you don't develop negative feelings, when you don't face that hate and destruction by another people, you will never develop memory. And so they're oblivious to their crimes. Their public and their government are oblivious to their crimes against the third world, and Korea is a perfect example of that. So they never form memory. Human beings need forgetting, okay? Just as to the opposite memory, it is an act of will. It requires one to think casually, to compute, to reflect, and to anticipate. This is the long story about how responsibility originated. We humans are weak. We need to forget. However, people cannot but remember that which is burned in. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. Pain is the most powerful aid to mnemonics. So the U.S. government never faces real family destruction, right? All your family members never get murdered in your vicious campaign. So you'll never form hurt in your memory. So you'll never have to talk truthful about your memory. Remember, it's psychology. The United States government uses its psychology because it has such a dangerous hardware and hateful whites that are jealous. And that is why they are able to get away with this, because they forget. The Washington bureaucrats don't sit and have, memory pain. They don't have pain of what happened to their families, because their families sit nice in the United States and are hated across the world. So remember that. If you don't form memory properly, you'll never give true history. And that is why the United States never gives us true history. They give us lies and fraud that is meant to forget the wars that they do. World War II was the good war and outright victory to be celebrated. Vietnam tore the United States apart. With Korea, there is less a presence than an absence. Okay, so it's the forgotten war. Korea is the forgotten war. Okay, it's South Koreans experience a knot of terrible loss, tragedy, bitterness, fate, invisible burdens, and an inner negation pushing them down and bending them inward, which they call ban. North Koreans remember a scourge that claimed on average at least one member from every family. But here is the party of memory, laser focus, burned in remembrance of things past. So when you lose family members, every one of your family has one death or more than one death, you will imprint that in your memory. It will never be forgotten. Just like that, Koreans face invisible burdens, tragedy, terrible loss, family members murdered, all of that stuff. It will imprint in the South Korean memory. The United States, the only thing that imprints is their prostitution. Their hate and jealousy is what is imprinted, and that's why they're fraud historians. For years, I rejected the forgotten war rubric. The unknown war seems much better. But for Americans, Korea is both a forgotten war and a never-known war. The war was to disappear from consciousness as soon as the fighting stabilized. The first time it was named forgotten to my knowledge came in 1951 as the title of an article, U.S. News and World Report. Consensual amnesia was the American reaction, an almost instant reaction to the Vietnam War. Television reinforced the forgetting by maintaining a respectful silence after U.S. troops departed in 1973, even though this suddenly forgotten war was hardly over. So, when you unleash your genocidal hardware, your napalm all over civilians in Vietnam, then you just immediately don't have to worry because you never experienced loss, right? The bureaucrats in Washington don't experience loss, and they make the history. So they make the American public forget. It is an enterprise of fraud. It is an enterprise of hateful, jealous whites of the United States. Their public and their government are involved in an enterprise of hate and jealousy against the third world. You never experience loss because you unload your genocidal, hateful hardware against the third world. You need to watch yourself, white man. You need to watch yourself, you Washington, gangsters. Okay, so now that the war is over, says the chorus Antigone, forget the war. But if war is never over, how can it be forgotten? So Korean War was never over, but the United States still forgot about it. For Americans, Korea is just one among several wars best forgotten since we are batting only 1 in 4 big wars since 1945. Just another transient episode among a myriad of interventions in the third world countries that do not bear close examination if one cares about amour propre, but have unsettling ways of coming back to haunt us. In Iran, for example, or Guatemala. So he compares the Korean War to Iran or Guatemala. We just forget, right? A myriad of interventions, all of which were despicable and failed interventions by the United States. Every one of their interventions is a despicable military dictatorship intervention that resulted in massive loss of life. But you just forget. You just recycle the memory because you sit in Washington on our lazy whites and do nothing for the people of the world. Just remember that. You're just lazy whites that do nothing and you give no history so that you can forget. Okay, like a snake. So basically you sit like a snake that swallows a rabbit and sits motionless in front of the sun while it digests. Okay, that's the United States. There's snakes that sit there and digest their fodder, the history, it just digests, and then they, put out their, they just have no responsibility is basically what he's saying. Like a snake that digests, it lies motionless, it has no responsibility. Just like that, the whites of Washington, their history has no responsibility. They just sit there and put out whatever they want. Okay, a nagging problem still remains, unlike Hitler invading Poland, Tojo attacking Pearl Harbor, or Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. Koreans invaded Korea. So Koreans invaded Korea. This was the Korean War. 38th parallel decision, 1945, taken unilaterally with the Americans, was the invitation to such a conflict that has in fact arisen. Okay, the Civil War, we talked about the North and South. Remember, if the British had fought alongside the South in the Civil War, how would the Americans have reacted? Right? If you put an imaginary line between North and South and the British decided to fight with the South against the North, how would the Americans have reacted? The same way you apply that to Korea. How could the Koreans react when you put an imaginary line as the DMZ and, you have to fight a war between each other? That's the explanation. You can't do it, right? The Americans wouldn't allow it, but they allow it in Korea because they're hateful, jealous, anti-third world whites. Okay, ever since this 1950 Civil War analogy has been like Rumpelstiltskin for the official American view, that Kim committed international aggression. Say it and the logic collapses. The interpretation loses power. Okay, so, Kim committed international aggression by attacking the South. It's not logical. This is not logical if you use the Civil War same standards that the United States uses when they talk about their conflict. Okay, Stokes happened to be right The longevity of this conflict finds its reason in the essential nature of the war. The thing we need to know first, it was a civil war, primarily by Koreans from conflicting social systems for Korean goals. So this was a civil war. The Korean War was a civil war. That's the important thing. The North's attack across the 38th parallel was no different than Mao's legions crossing the Yangtze River into South China. And we can add Hanoi's regular armies roaring out of the Central Highlands in 1975. The civil wars in China and Vietnam ended with infantry divisions, and Korea would have too, if we think of June 1950 as an end to decades of inter-Korean conflict, a denouement instead of a beginning. So if the United States hadn't invaded, the tanks would have rolled through and the Korea would have been unified under a socialist and nationalist government. It's a terrible thing that it didn't happen. The United States is responsible for that, in addition to 5 million deaths. And nobody is happy in the Korean subcontinent because of the United States' jealous, hateful anti-Third World whites. So it also presumes to demarcate the period of active involvement before June 1950. It was Syngman Rhee against Kim Il-sung, backed or controlled by Stalin and her Mao. After July 1953, it is Rhee against the same people, his fledgling republic, under threat. So basically, it was Rhee against Kim Il-sung after 1953. The construction focuses the bright glare of our attention on the question of who started the war, on the presupposition that the correct answer to this question furnished the answer to all other questions. So again, America goes off on, who started this war. It is at best irrelevant who started the war. Whether it is a just war, whether it should have been fought like a civil war is what the question is, what Bruce Cummings is saying. It is irrelevant that you go off on a tangent and an irrelevant, hateful jealousy of who started the war. The United States started the war, and that is why they are responsible for the war. Okay, basically it obscures, placing in the shadows of irrelevance, in a matter of wrongly conceived and never known civil conflict, disappears before our very eyes. An American construction that only an American could believe, but American amour propre remains famously intact. American focus on who started is a political and often an ideological position, a point of honor that abstracts from the make easy and comprehensible the politically shaped verdict that began with Washington's official story on June 25th, 1950. So who started it is irrelevant. Okay, the United States focus on that for the honor of the conflict. The United States is dishonorable in this conflict. Their invasion of the North created a dishonorable United States. Whatever they say, their European colonial mafia, however they attribute it, with their mafia of the U.S. government, Britain and France, the United States is responsible, and there is no honor in this war. The Korean War was and is a civil war. Only the conceptions can account for the 100,000 lives lost in the South before June 1950 and the continuity of the conflict down to the present, in spite of the assumption that Moscow's puppets in Pyongyang would surely collapse after the USSR itself met oblivion in 1991. Okay, so basically, this war is a civil war. Okay, it's a South versus North civil war. And it's not because Moscow's puppets in Pyongyang would have collapsed. There's still a conflict there, and it retains the conflict. Okay, so we talked about all the victory, neither a victory like World War II or a defeat like Vietnam. It struck a glancing blow at young people who looked up to their parents who fought this big war, had yet encountered Vietnam, and seem ultimately to have been bewildered by Korea, not to have seen the war in its fullness and quickly to have passed it by. The war was and remains, after all, a stark counterpoint to the Halcyon 1950s, the easy like Ike years of full employment. Okay, so basically he goes into U.S. Hollywood and all of these things, basically putting, Hollywood and Elvis Presley and all this stuff for white folks to forget the war. Okay, they just bury the war under this Hollywood rich white, murderous, racist, hateful, jealous whites. They bury it in their Hollywood schemes, and that is why it is a forgotten war. It's not because it's not known, it's forgotten because of their Hollywood, Hollywood and, Elvis and all this white folk nonsense that they put through. The action takes place. Okay, so there was a film on this, Bridges at Rhee. The best known Hollywood action takes place on a narrative in Japan. Tokoria's Japanese pronunciation of a Korean village. It appeared when Hollywood felt itself besieged by McCarthyism and neatly avoided all controversies of this war. Okay, he remembers winter mornings, Korean women serving him bunja, orange juice, sex slaves of Koreans. He remembers all of this. This is an American soldier in, Korea. Okay, the narrative line, Tokori is the Japanese pronunciation for a Korean village. He staffed this village during World War II. Okay, he developed an understanding of what was happening. And basically, there are American memoirs of this war. For nearly all of them follow Tokori narrative. So basically the same thing. Korea, we don't know Korea. But we do know the Japanese are a civilized, beautiful, and petite culture only to be admired. They have golf courses, floor shows, and gigs. And that is what the whites are. This is the principled whites that we say. The disciplined whites. Petiteness. Right? Everybody else in China and Korea is not petite and are ugly. Is that what the U.S. government is saying? They're racist, hateful, jealous anti-third world whites. Your statements are seen and exposed here. Your statements of racism against the Chinese and Korean people is exposed by these comments in this Hollywood film of Tokori, the bridge at Tokori. So remember that. The Japanese, the approach, the Japanese aesthetics, the aesthetics of a petite culture in Asia is what the U.S. is obsessed with. And they murder half the world for their racism, hate, and jealousy for their own personal aesthetics, their white aesthetics, which is not even universally accepted. So let's skip a few pages. Okay, so basically on Amazon.com. So you look at books. There are no books on the Korean War. Remember that, books on the Korean War, not available, very poor, selection, very poor books. Acheson made a colossal gaffe at the press club in January 1950 by leaving South Korea out of his defense minister, or Kim Il-sung was dependent on plaything of the Russians and Chinese, or that the invasion of the North in the fall of 1950 was MacArthur's idea, or that the June 1950 invasion started this conflict. So basically, Acheson played lies. He said that MacArthur started the conflict. It was not, there was no defense perimeter. Korea wasn't involved. It was involved secretly. He knew it, but he didn't report it in his speech. Okay, so all-purpose former general, Syngman Rhee, the president, Peck, the all-purpose former general trotted out for every prominent visiting journalist since the war ended, who fought alongside Imperial Japan and was for decades a close associate of Japanese war criminals, such as Sasakawa Ryoichi and assorted unrepentant Nazis. This is Paek San-yop. Okay, Paek San-yop is a war criminal. He was friends with Japanese war criminals and assorted unrepentant Nazis. Okay, so this is the kind of people that are fighting for South Korea with Syngman Rhee. Okay, so how do you trust this? This is something you have to just ask, right? You have a friend with Nazis, a friend with Japanese war criminals, fighting as the main 17th Regimental commander, and you have to understand how it's it's kind of shady. It's a shady American thing. There is absolutely nothing on the atrocious massacres of this war, okay, or the American incendiary bombing campaign. Instead, Korea is a shrimp among whales, an insignificant country with a bunch of leaders who, it seems, are hard to take seriously, and so on. Okay, the coldest winter is one of the best in a peculiar but common American genre count that of the war that evince almost no knowledge of Korea or its history, barely get past 2 or 3 Korean names, and focus on the American experience in the war, where Koreans and Chinese were much more numerous, and fail to question the accumulated baggage of 1950 stereotypes about the good guys and bad guys. So this is the coldest winter, this is American history books. This is American history books. Basically, it focuses us on nothing. It gives us no knowledge about the Korean people. It gives us no knowledge about the Korean leaders, what they stood for, what they were about. It just gives us the American lies, the hateful jealousy of the Washington whites. Nonetheless, this genre exercise a strong influence in the United States, perhaps a subliminal one, in that extensive knowledge of the war is not required, perhaps a hegemonic one that is well-known analysts easily perform in logic in a few sentences. Not many writers were better or more perspicacious guides as George Bush administration and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Henry Herberg's of the New Yorker. Okay, so basically, this is not unique to the Korean War. The U.S. history books just don't tell the truth. They don't tell the truth. Their, books are, subliminal one. They don't really require you a knowledge of the war. They actually want you not to know the war. They want you to know just the American, perspective of what happened. Our GIs were mistreated. There were POWs, and then everything else is forgotten because they're hateful, jealous whites of Washington. Okay, so basically, legitimate in their origins, scrupulous in their, execution. This is what they describe the Korean and Gulf War It's not, these are not legitimate wars. Okay, the United States would take the problem to the UN Security Council. Acheson should come attack. Acheson implied that should an attack come here, U.S. would take the problem to the UN Security Council. Dean Rusk said this a year earlier in July 1945, exactly when the war erupted. In the many drafts leading up to the speech, South Korea was consistently seen as a direct American responsibility, along with Japan. Okay, in the end, it worked out beautifully for Acheson, who was seeking ambiguity and trying to help both the communists and volatile allies such as Syngman Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek guessing about what the United States would do if South Korea or Taiwan were attacked. Okay, so Acheson, it worked out beautifully. The way this thing happened, they were looking to take it to the UN. They took it to the UN. North Korea, it was instigated into an invasion. They took it to the UN, and it worked out beautifully for Acheson. The goal this winter is best at examining the major American protagonists, though through definitely written portraits, Acheson, Truman, Ken, and MacArthur, and especially Pinky MacArthur, his mother. It was the age of Acheson. Okay, so basically, the war was a constituency of one, Harry Truman. Okay, so this was Harry Truman's war. Okay, MacArthur made no decision that was central to the war except his fateful one to split his army corps as they marched into the north. So this was Truman's war. Every command was issued by Truman. So Truman goes down for the command to invade the north. Okay, that's ultimately what it is. What destroyed American credibility in the world and is still an American incredible nation, a nation of complete lack of credibility is the United States of America. Truman, it goes down for this destruction of American credibility by invading the North. Okay, most Americans prefer to know as little as possible in the war. Okay, remember that. The Americans didn't want to know about this war. It was one of those wars they wanted to forget. Okay, no historian is going to tell David Halberstam that Dean Acheson and Harry Truman were not the good guys, and MacArthur was not the author of this war's essential failure. So Halberstam is, delusional. He thinks that, MacArthur was the bad guy, and Acheson and Truman were the good guys. He's delusional. MacArthur was, one of the bad guys. But Truman and Acheson were the real bad guys. They issued the commands, and they ruined the credibility of the United States. The one city that escaped the war, Busan, was for his nightmare of refugees, gangs of ragged children, and kids pimping. Nice blowjob. This is the kind of thing the United States Army does. The kids pimping, blowjob, this, that. This is great for the United States Army troops. They do this kind of thing in their wars, and that's how you can see their discipline and their international reputation as GIs. Okay, so Syngman Rhee, the George Washington creed to American politicians, was as a tyrant and fascist as Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, so Syngman Rhee was just like Chiang Kai-shek. He was a tyrant. He was a fascist. So through Chinese eyes, basically, there's a book, Ha Jin's novel, War Trash, rings true to every page, a closely observed and much pondered experience. Okay, embraces the mass of humanity clustered in Korea during the war. Okay, Yalu finds an empty land with at least 4/5 of the houses leveled to the ground by the U.S., napalm firebombing. The image of a blind woman in a roughly white dress packing through the garbage dump with a toddler on her back reflects the persistence and human resilience of the race. Okay, so the Koreans sang songs sometimes for hours. Korean women sang songs sometimes for hours in the evening and remained fond of cosmetics, that most of the pouch of stuff to make their faces. Okay, the Chinese over 40 bothered wearing skirts, okay, but Koreans wanted to wear skirts. He noticed the Chinese and North Korean soldiers paid for what they took from civilians, whereas South Koreans just took what they wanted. That's the way the West is. They foster capitalism. You just walk in and grab and go. In the Korean houses, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or not. You can just grab and go because they're hateful, jealous, racist whites. Okay, and how is it a Chinese French soldier thinks these things, but apparently Americans didn't? Right, so Chinese soldiers notice what happens, how the South Koreans treated the Korean people. Then he was captured. He wondered why American doctors and nurses were so kind to him. Why did American soldiers make North Korean soldiers strip naked after their captors, right? The United States says that North Koreans committed crimes. This is factual. The U.S. soldiers made the North Korean soldiers strip naked in front of them. Is that not a crime by the Geneva Convention? Of course it is. And the United States won't accept these crimes because they're hateful, jealous, anti-third world whites. They are snake-like scoundrels, as Mao Zedong called them. And basically what it is, villages after villages were erased by American jets, okay? They used flamethrowers to just erase villages, okay? So he interviewed Pak Chang-uk in Pyongyang. He was a double amputee of American murderous butchery, and he gave a big description of the war and how the North Korean POWs, Dodd's capture and subduing of North Korean POWs in Camp 76, and basically, you know, he has many daughters and a son, and he survived this war, and he would do it again. That's the important thing. North Koreans' principle is they would do it again. The United States, there are no principles in America. It's just hateful, jealous, anti-third world whites. And that's it. The Korean War, a history, the 2 chapters. We're going to come back for 2 chapters tomorrow. We'll have the book in making 4 days. Glad you could join us today. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.